I will now like to open the floor to questions, but I'd also like to point out to you that if you have any questions on Mr. Evans' paper, Dr. Deunan, who is co-author on that paper, will take those questions. So, please come forward.
All right. Oh, sorry. Could I ask a question? Huh?
Yes, we're ready.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for your presentations. Dr. Deunan, and I think this question is for you. I know I am the co-author on the paper, but sitting down and listening to the paper, I had a few ideas and I have a few questions that it didn't occur to me in the several reads and rereads. But the piece on the environment and that negative relationship, I think that we can probably explore. I'm thinking maybe it can be explored by way of, the whole concept of the Hartwick rule and the impact that has as a sort of a what we call that, the depreciation of that to some element. I am not certain how that would be. Maybe that, if you can respond to that, on your thoughts on that. Sir Darcy, I think that paper is a very noble and brave piece of research in looking at the efficiency of the public sector, looking at the largest employer in the country. And so we're talking about it. Now, I wonder, though, with a 7 S's framework, given that it is the public sector, and public sector distinctively operates quite different from the private sector, to what extent the 7 S's can be used as a guide? I'm wondering to what extent that can be effectively, or would it be that this a modified version of the 7 S's may be more appropriate for use in that regard? Primarily because when we look at public enterprises in the realm of public finance and how it operates, it's quite different, and a lot of inefficiencies would be held in there. I also took note of the whole issue of the other areas that you were talking about, and I am wondering if that issue of the productivity itself is an entirely different, separate issue, not to be, what I'm saying is that some of it is far-reaching in the implications, and I'm wondering if separating it out might be a little bit more helpful in looking at productivity. And if you're looking at productivity, how do you propose that we begin to capture this by way of measuring it? Because I think the most recent study that I came across in labor productivity is a market study that was done by some consultants with the Ministry of Labor somewhere in 2012, 11, or somewhere. It's dated, and it pointed to a 0.01 increases in productivity over the span of that. Because if it is, I agree with the issue of the performance-based, or performance-based productivity. But I'm wondering to what extent we would need to really do some primary data collection to drive an initiative like that, and how you propose going forward with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Conrad, any other questions?
I have a few comments, I think, rather than questions. My first comment goes to the first presenter. In your presentation, you spoke to the strength of the financial sector and the level of financial sector development interchangeably. And I think you might want to make some definitional distinctions in your paper in terms of defining financial sector development, which I recognized when you were looking at the empirical part of the paper. That's what you really were utilizing rather than financial sector strength, because you would be, in that case, need to look at measures of financial sector fragility. So it might be useful to make that distinction in the paper, primarily because from my perspective, when I'm thinking about it, there are two issues. Financial sector development, when you look at the crisis literature, excessive development actually promotes some fragility at some point of the business cycle. So you may want to make that distinction. You spoke as well to FDI and the promotion of financial sector development, hampering the effects of FDI. You might want to look at, have some more analytical discussion, policy discussion in that context. Because from my policy experience, what I'm seeing is, it's maybe what you might need to look at is the channels. Because in some cases, what you see, while you may have FDI, foreign direct investment, particularly in the tourism sector, for instance, in St. Lucia, what you have is a foreign direct investment partner actually dominating the entire chain of the industry. So you will have, for instance, a Sandals that operates like a taxi operator, a tour operator. They do the weddings, they do the honeymoons, they do the tours, they do everything. And therefore, you might not necessarily get the impact that you want from financial sector, the FDI that you're getting versus what you are giving in terms of your incentive structure. So you might want to look at your incentive versus your benefit. Have sort of a discussion about that in the paper to give you a good sense of all that is going on, the dynamics in terms of financial sector development, growth, and the financial sector. But I do agree that financial development, in the sense that if you have some critical reforms that improve the things like access to finance and business reforms, that can allow for the development of small businesses that feed off bigger FDI investment. So I agree there. In terms of the paper by Sharida, I think it's a very big challenge to take on, looking at the public sector and the effectiveness of it. The public sector is a very complex animal. I work in the public sector, and I think I noticed that Conrad asked whether the McKinsey 75 framework might be a good framework to utilize to assess it. From my perspective, I would say I don't think so, because of the complexity of the public sector. Perhaps you would need to utilize a framework that allows you for greater measurement of what is happening in the public sector at different levels. You did allude to the doing business report for the World Bank, and it would be useful to perhaps utilize more of that, because a lot of the indicators actually come out of the roles of the public service in facilitating economic growth, although you highlighted that the public service is not so structured. So it'd be useful, I think, to put more emphasis on some of those indicators and see where that lies. One of your recommendations regarding the centralization of power of the Public Service Commission, I think from a private sector perspective, when you look at it, it sounds really good. But when you work in the public sector and you interact with the policy, the key decision makers in the public sector, who are the politicians, you will then understand the important role of the Public Service Commission, and perhaps a reform of the public service which minimizes the role of the Public Service Commission might not necessarily be the best one, but you might probably need to look at one that provides you a blend where managers in the public service have a little bit more independence, but you still have some central command at the level of the Public Service Commission. These are a few of my comments for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else? Students? Go right ahead.
Good afternoon to all again. Ms. Sharda Sardasi, thank you for your presentation. I think it's very inspiring when we see UE alumni, and especially very recent or current UE students, making a contribution directly to national diversification and national development. My question to you, especially so in a time of cutbacks and a shortage of money, etc., it becomes even more topical the issue of public sector productivity and efficiency, but you also have to balance against this, because just yesterday I was speaking to someone about the contract situation in the public service, and this is done across the region as a way to kind of minimize costs, kind of have them on a sort of consultancy thing, so you could show the IMF you don't have X number of people on your payroll, etc. And it looks good politically. You didn't hire as much people as the past government, whatever. But that also has issues in terms of, and it comes up in the private sector as well, as I'm sure you know, employee morale, employee productivity, when they're concerned about the tenure of their jobs. So I don't know how far the research has gone in that direction. If you have any suggestions, any thoughts about balancing the need for cost effectiveness and savings of government expenditure, which wages is the largest component of, but at the same time, in order to do their jobs efficiently and make a difference, they have to have and be independent and free from things like corruption, because there's always a Singapore model where people say they pay them highly enough so they won't be tempted by things like bribes. So what do we do to balance the two? The cost effectiveness, but the necessity of public servants to be independent and have a certain level of security of tenure and insulation from political influence. So just your thoughts on that, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll turn to the panel.
You guys hear me? Okay. Just when I was getting comfortable thinking my co-author is in the audience and I'll present and he feels the difficult questions, I get the question. I'm kidding. I appreciate the question. Dr. Conrad and I have been going back and forth in terms of, we think that there are many useful policy implications that come from this and different ways to move forward with the research. I want to address, and I appreciate the comments by Tracy as well, because it helps us in interpreting certain things that we see within the model. There's this bigger question. Guyana has found oil. Guyana has traditionally been a poorer country within the region. And in some ways, this may be a historic opportunity for Guyana to transform, to utilize this resource to transform themselves, transform economic development. That's where the interest for the topic came from. Of course, it has implications for our own development as well. What we see within the model right now is that the benefits of FDI are occurring through financial sector development. But importantly, FDI by itself outside of that sector has negative implications. And I take Dr. Conrad's comment here that perhaps future research can look into, this is a start, and future research can look into possible areas, channels through which that negative impact is occurring. The point in this paper was really to look at one particular channel where the financial development is actually helping in the context of a weak financial sector or poor financial development. But that's something we can take on. In terms of Tracy's comments, I like the comments. I take your point as well that when you have FDI being dominated by in certain sectors, sometimes you may not always experience the benefits that you think that you have. And that's actually something we see within the model as well. When we look at the causal linkages, there aren't any short-run causal linkages. And even in the long run, the benefits accrue slowly. Slowly and relatively, the effects may not be as large as in other countries as well. I think that your comment might be one particular explanation for that phenomenon, in that FDI has been targeted to one particular sector, which is the natural resource sector, and that inherently has problems of in itself. When you talk about FDI going to the mining sector and forestry sector, those are humongous sectors where the consumption of oil energy occurs. And it raises the possibility of environmental degradation, which is Dr. Conrad's comment that we need to look at that further. It's possible, as well as, we've known that countries that specialize in natural resource sectors also have problems with corruption. And that's another potential channel that we may want to look at, to what extent that's occurring. Those are policy relevant questions, all geared towards enhancing the effect. We need to understand where the hiccups are, because if Guyana is going to benefit from FDI and use it to transform themselves, it critically hinges on not just magnifying the effect, but also evaluating where that hiccup is so that we can mitigate those types of effects. I think I'll stop there for the comments, and I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Thank you for the questions. I'll start from the first one, Dr. Conrad. So the first part of your question regarding how appropriate the McKinsey 7S framework was and whether or not it would be best to employ a modified version of it. The answer to that is yes. The reason that we chose this framework is because, so the diagram itself wasn't in the presentation. However, within the diagram, it places the shared values at the center of the diagram with the other 6 elements surrounding it, but it also shows the interconnectedness between all 7 elements. And to us, that was what was most relevant for our public service, because our public service, a lot of people, if they're not familiar with the public service or the public sector, they actually think of the public service as perhaps just the ministries or perhaps just the service commissions. They don't realize that it's both of these things, as well as a lot of other organizations who all need to work together, and also who all have their own separate issues that need to be addressed in order for the public service and the public sector as a whole to be efficient. Regarding the second part of your question, the productivity, I am actually going to do what Dr. Doonan was not able to do and pass that on to my co-author. So Karen, probably if you could answer that at the end while I take up the other 2. The second commenter, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Tracy. Yes. So the different models for the different levels of the public service, that is definitely a very good point. And thank you. That's definitely something for us to look at moving forward. In terms of the service commissions, where I had mentioned the devolution of power, that is specifically discussed in the paper related to the HR aspects of the service commissions, where we stated that, so the Constitution does allow for the devolution of power from the service commissions to the permanent secretaries of the various ministries. So that means that not every single little thing regarding a public servant, whether it's a disciplinary matter, an administrative matter, a promotion matter, needs to go back to the service commission, which can then take an extended period of time. It can be handled, if that devolution of power takes place, it can then be handled in-house in the ministry, and 1, ease up on red tape, and 2, just get things moving a lot faster. I'm sorry, what?
And 3, a lot of politicians send this down on that way. Every political cycle, which is why the Public Service Commission was established, because
Yes, the tension between the political and administrative directorates. However, it's important to know here that when it comes to the public servants, the permanent secretary is the officer responsible. A minister legally does not have the authority to fire a public servant.
the permanent secretary is something.
Right, yeah.
Okay, let me just introduce the co-author, and he is Dr. Karen Niles. He's currently the Business Unit Manager for the Research and Policy at the Economic Development Advisory Board of Trinidad and Tobago. Within his portfolio, Dr. Niles also has responsibility for promoting and facilitating economic diversification, particularly as it relates to agriculture, the creative sector, and the energy sector. Just to give you a small introduction to him. Go ahead, Dr. Niles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should update that since I wrote the paper, I actually left, and I'm now at UE. Interestingly, so I'm at the Institute for International Relations right here. I'm a lecturer. The first thing, let me just go back. There's 2 steps before I come forward, right? I think the first thing to note with regards to the applicability of the 7S model is, my first degree is in government. We could have used a public sector management model, but we deliberately chose not to. The issue that we wanted to focus on was organizational effectiveness. You have an objective. It's a commercial objective or it's a social objective. How well do you achieve that objective, period? So it's somewhat of a blunt instrument, so we do acknowledge that it is a blunt instrument that we used, but it was kind of intentional, that we wanted to kind of actually illustrate the point that it's either you are serving your purpose or you're not serving your purpose. So that's one of the reasons that we went with the more blunt instrument in that case. The second thing is about the separating of the labor productivity issues. Have you been to the passport office recently, or licensing, or any public office, and you had to I went to immigration yesterday and spent 6 hours for a very, very simple task. We actually thought about removing productivity and dealing with that separately as well. But to talk about public sector reform in Trinidad and Tobago and not directly address labor productivity in a meaningful way is problematic. So we had to make sure it was a central tenet of the paper. And yes, it can be its own paper, and it is its own paper in several other iterations. But the question of labor productivity, for anyone that's had to use pretty much any public service in Trinidad and Tobago, it is an issue. When you walk in the office and they're chewing gum and they're on the phone and they're not taking you on, we have significant issues. So that's one of the reasons why we dealt with it specifically in this. As it pertains to the service commissions, the issue here is that they're enshrined into the Constitution, right? And you're saying that they're meant to be somewhat of they're supposed to protect the public servants from the politicians, right? So there's some issues with that. Now, bear in mind, I have to give a disclaimer. Our chairman, Dr. Terence Farrell, who will be here tomorrow, has said on occasion that he thinks that we should rip it out of the Constitution. It doesn't mean that, one, that's not what we present to the table. Two, it also doesn't mean that we want to disband the service commissions. But take, for example, you have a child in a school, and your child's in front of a teacher who takes his pants down in front of the children and starts cursing. The dean of that school can't take action, really. The school supervisor can't take action. The principal can't take action. It has to go up to the Teaching Service Commission. No, but I spoke to them. Literally speaking, when we spoke to them, what happens, and actually above the Service Commission, there's actually a whole floor of lawyers that confirm that it has to go up to the Service Commission. There has to be an investigation, and then that investigation trickles all the way back down to the classroom. All that time, that teacher is still in front of your child. The current system, as it stands with the service commissions are not protecting us. They're not protecting public servants after being in the public service for more than 3 years. Even the established public servants will tell you the service commission is more than just a protector. Yes, that's an important feature, but at the end of the day, with or without the service commissions, the politicians will still transfer you from one ministry to another. If they don't like you, they'll still move you from one to another. They won't fire you, and they can't actually take away your promotions and your benefits, but they will still take one permanent secretary and say, you giving me trouble, I put you in a ministry that does nothing, or is not in your specialty. We've seen it time and time again. So what we saying? Okay. So which ministry are you talking about? Okay. Right.
I used to be the permanent secretary of economic planning, and now I'm the permanent secretary of housing.
So that's the point.
Otherwise known as
So that's the point.
Right? Without the service commission, these things will happen. But I think we are fundamentally underestimating the level of the creep that could happen in the operations of the public service in the absence of the commission. Right?
Yeah, we're not saying this band.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah, we're not saying this
we are
band.
fundamentally underestimating the level of creep and interference that can occur in the affairs of the public service in the absence of a commission.
Sure.
Because the commission will and can send certain things. Now, a permanent secretary is not appointed by a commission. A permanent secretary is appointed by the head of state.
Sure.
Right? So I think we underestimate the level of creep that could occur. One. Two, the other thing is that if you have a system where the authority is blended in the sense that the permanent secretary has some level of authority, so you allow for the permanent secretary to be able to influence make some decisions at a certain level, but still allow for the Public Service Commission to make decisions at another level. It helped. So for instance, the permanent secretary can't hire anybody not grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, everything goes to the Public Service Commission. But if you allow for certain levels the permanent secretary could have some sticks, because there are no sticks in the public service. I agree with you. There are no sticks, there are no carrots, right? So if you could allow for an incentive framework that allows the permanent secretary to effectively manage the ministry or the department, I agree. But total removal of the commission, one needs to be very mindful of, because we are underestimating the level of creep that could happen in the absence of a commission.
So I totally agree. And one of the things I want to make clear is that we're not saying disband them. We're not saying get rid of service commissions. And I want to make that very clear. That's not what the paper is saying. But there's some fundamental questions you need to ask about service commissions. One is, do they need to be enshrined in the Constitution, is the first thing. I don't know if they need to be enshrined in the Constitution the way that they are today. And then the second thing, and the last thing before I sit down, the last thing is, the question you need to ask yourself is, that balance of power between the PS and the commissions right now, in terms of operationally getting things done, currently that does not make sense, particularly with the number of contract workers you have in the public service right now. It just does not make operational sense, and things take reasonably a long time to get done, and it's majorly inefficient.
Okay, this is a lovely discussion that you have gotten yourselves involved in, and I hope that you take this discussion further as we finish up day 1 and we go into day 2. As I bring this session to a close.
Dr. Mohammed?
I know.
I had one more question.
Sure, go right ahead.
Yes, so for the last question regarding the wages versus basically independent work, right? I think both of those things could be addressed, if not wholly, at least in a large part, by the fundamental structure of the public service and its various organizations. And what I mean by that is, and this is where the shared values, the strategy, and the structure are linked. So you have this national development goal, agenda, plan, whatever. And in order to do that, you need to have a structure which encompasses certain positions that you need certain positions in order to achieve those goals and objectives. So that structure supports that strategy. What we have right now is a structure and a strategy that do not support each other. But if we did, then to me, we wouldn't really be facing these issues, because within that structure as well, you would have things like the ILO's decent work agenda, which it talks about things, it goes beyond just wages. It talks about your work-life balance, flexibility, whether or not you are doing valuable work. So to me, this question, it really needs to be addressed at a structural and a strategic level. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Please, audience, join me with thanking the members and the panel in session 3, FDI, Financial Development and Competitiveness, Dr. Deonanan and Dr. Darren Conrad, Ms. Sharda Sardar Singh and Dr. Kiran Niles, Mr. Kembert Evans and Dr. Deonanan.